The meta is healthy, the meta is diverse, there are so many decks you can play. That's usually what you hear from people when they talk about Pauper. But is this really the truth? Most people even struggle to define what a healthy meta is. So we will do just that in this video. Not only define what makes a format healthy, but also check if Pauper is in a good and healthy state right now. Afterwards, we deduce how and what is going on with Pauper going into the winter season and into the new year. But before we can make any prophecies, we need to ask ourselves, what are we actually looking for? We are defining a healthy format with two metrics. First, do you see a lot of different decks or archetypes when you are playing? Is one deck or archetype dominating? Famously, Modern was the gold standard when it came to format diversity. The most played deck used to not have a meta share above 10%, making you play against a big variety of decks and cards. Is this the same in Pauper? And second, how many different strategies are viable? Is the spectrum of aggro-control combo balanced? Magic's categorization of decks into macro strategies is well known, and a healthy format offers successful decks in all of those categories. For a perfect healthy format, you want a lot of different macro strategies to be represented. This also includes decks that muddy the waters between those categories, for example midrange being a control aggro strategy. Think of Borrow Synthesizer or combo control decks like Jeskai Ephemerate. To visualize, we use this triangle. We see aggro at the top, control to the left, and combo to the right. Within this triangle, we can look at three more different things. First, how fast does the deck want to win? Decks located at the top of the triangle will try to win fast, and to the bottom will be fine going into the late game and staving off early aggression. Second, we can look how linear a deck is. You can also describe this attribute as how reactionary a deck will play. Decks to the bottom left will be very reactionary or non-linear, meaning they will usually try to stop their opponents instead of trying to establish a winning state proactively like decks to the top right. Finally, we can look how fair or unfair a deck plays. This has nothing to do with cheating, but is an attribute of playstyle. Fair decks will advance their resources linearly, aka one land at a time, and will play their resources to the board. Playing 1-for-1 removal is also a fair thing. You play one card that answers one card of your opponent. Unfair decks will manipulate resources in a way that is not linear, not step by step. Combo decks are categorized as unfair because their whole game plan revolves around generating enough resources to win the game in one go. Unfair decks will be listed to the bottom right, and on the opposite side, on the top left, decks will be considered fair. Aggro control decks, or better known as mid-range decks, are amongst the most fair decks, usually playing one thing at a time, trading resources one by one, and accumulating advantages turn by turn. Now that we can establish if a format is healthy, are people lying when they say this format is healthy? To determine this, we will look at the meta share. You could adopt other strategies, but the biggest question is, if you compete in a challenge, are the decks chosen and played in a way that we can describe as diverse and well balanced? We are not interested necessarily if a deck is overpowered, but rather if players play in a way that form a healthy meta by the metrics described previously. Therefore, we choose to look at meta share. We can see that Mono Red is much more heavily represented than the rest of decks. And since those decks are sorted by meta share, we see a more or less steady decline. This looks very normal for Pauper standards. If you would look at similar graphs throughout the last 1 to 2 years, they will always look like this. Mono Red has always been a fan favorite in online Magic, and other archetypes like Affinity or a Mono Blue Tempo deck are mainstays in the Pauper metagame. But here's a question for you. Are those really different archetypes? And the answer to that is a lot of those decks fall under the same archetype. We can spot at least one archetype that is spanning over different decks in this figure, and that would be decks built around Tolarian Terror. We have Mono Blue Terror, we have Izzet Terror, and we have Dimir Terror. They all play a very similar core of cards, as they all want to enable a cheap Tolarian Terror, and those decks will always win in the same way by protecting their big creature. Now, let's group up those decks to look at the format more broadly. We can group the Terror lists, the Fairy decks have a lot of overlap, and let's also group the Brute Scale lists. Now the graph looks quite different. Terror decks are actually the most played decks in the format. Brute Scale climbed to the number 3 archetype, and Grixis dropped to the 4th. Based on this, we can argue that Terror and Red are tier 1, as well as Brute Scale and Grixis, and Gruul, Fairies, and all those other decks are below that. In essence, you will encounter different flavors of the same 4 strategies a lot. this format is not as diverse as it might seem. Now, if we also consider what cards those decks play, you will notice that, like I said before, the terror lists have a lot of overlap. Mono red is more or less in its own corner, but then if you look at Grixis Affinity and the Brute Scale lists, those are all fueled by Ichor Wellspring and Deadly Dispute. So even in those decks, you can say they have the same engines, but they just win differently. With Giant Wildfire also in this black-based artifact shell, we approach about 30% of meta playing some sort of Ichor Wellspring Deadly Dispute artifact meta stack. So we conclude that while a lot of different decks exist, about 30% of the meta falls into the artifact shell, about 16% falls into the terror shell, and we go down from there with Mono Red at 15.6%, followed then by Fairies and Gruul. Let's categorize decks into their strategies. If we look at the top 10 played decks, we see the following characterization. Overall, the top 10 decks make about 70% of the meta. We can see that most decks fall under the fair strategies, ranging from aggressive lists like Kuldotha to controlling decks like Izzet Control. Outliers are Turbofog, that is more akin to a prison deck, and Gruul Stompy, that very slightly will fall under the combo side of the triangle. The only real combo deck is Brute Scale. We can see that most decks are fair, and only Brute Scale is bringing balance. Overall, this doesn't look too bad, but also not too good. Where are the decks between control and combo? Like we had in previous metas, like the Flicker decks. Having combo aggro decks, I think, is a little bit more difficult. We currently have Gruul, but usually those control combo decks, like traditional blue-white control, are pillars of metas, but completely absent here. If we extend our scope to the top 20 decks, now making up about 90% of the meta, we can see a similar notion. Yes, we now have Familiars on the board as well as Cycle Storm, and bolstered our aggro side with more decks. The picture stays the same though, especially if we factor in that the newly added 10 decks make only 20% of the meta combined. We lack decks in the bottom right. You may not like it, but Brute Scale is the one deck that keeps this meta from falling apart. Without Brute Scale, instead of having a triangle, we would just operate on a straight line. We are basically asking, how fast do we want to go? And that would be it. So the verdict on this metric, strategy diversity, is we are hanging on by a thin thread. So, what do we make of this? First of all, Pauper is currently a very playable format. You can choose a good amount of decks you can win with. But if you get to the nitty-gritty of the format, everything is very samey. You will see way less unique cards than you might think, and since the meta is very established at this point, and a lot of more rogue decks got pushed out, you will encounter the same things over and over and over again. This makes the Pauper meta very stagnant at the moment, and looking at those decks lists and our little Foundations, Bloomburrow or even Duskborn added to the format, we can with certainty say that getting new cards into the Pauper format is impossibly difficult. All the cards currently in the format have been pushed so hard power level wise, it probably takes another design mistake to even try to make an impact. And that's terrible. So, what's the remedy? There are two ways for the Pauper format panel to address this, and realistically, there are three ways in total. The first option is to do nothing. Given the history of the format, this is probably the way forward, even though I think mid-term this will lead to a very stagnant and boring format similar to Pioneer, where nothing really changed for maybe a year and you play the same 3 decks back and forth for months. The second option is to ban cards, but this isn't a very easy thing to do, since you need to ban multiple cards to even make a dent. If you ban, for example, Tolarian Terror, which is a perfectly fine ban on its own, you haven't touched Affinity, Brute Scale or even Red. So you probably need to ban at least 4 to 5 cards to evenly impact the format and bring balance. And while this thought probably leads to the best overall meta, this is super unlikely. Historically, there were extended periods of time where one deck desperately needed a ban, but that ban wouldn't happen. This leads to the third and last way of dealing with this, unbanning cards. There are not many cards you should even consider unbanning, so this is also quite unlikely. So we are stuck in this impossible scenario where all actions we take have very impacting results on the format now and in the future. So not doing anything is the easy way out. This leaves us with a basically solved metagame, and the only thing we can hope for is for Wizards to make another design mistake to shake up the format.